everybody. I am thrilled to host this panel. We have our tax reform insiders with us today to talk about what's happening in Washington now. It's kind of interesting to go back and relitigate the discussions and the battles of tax reform, but the really important thing, I think, is to say, where does it take us from here? And so our tax reform insiders, who were there at every step of the way, from conception to enactment, from enactment to implementation, are here with us today. So we have Tom West with us, who is now a principal in our pass-throughs group, but was former tax legislative counsel at the Department of Treasury. And we also have Jennifer Acuna, who is now a principal on the legislative team along with me, who's also former chief tax counsel at the Senate Finance Committee. So we're very fortunate to have them both. We had a great chance to get inside the room to find out how some of these things that we're talking about for the rest of the day, today and tomorrow, played out. So why don't we just start with that, give you guys an opportunity to talk a little bit about your role in developing and implementing tax reform. Just give people an idea of what you did, because to me, anyway, that's really interesting. So Jennifer, why don't we start with you? Just give us an overview of what you did.
Sure. So when I hear that, I read stories about how tax reform was done in 3 months. It was developed, drafted, and passed in 3 months' time. I wish, right? That was certainly not my experience, and it began a long, long time ago. Back when I was at Ways and Means in 2011 was when the real tax reform push began, with the development of many international tax proposals that were released as discussion drafts, Option C. That developed into what is now the GILTI, ultimately. And that ultimately morphed on the House side into the border adjusted tax. After that, I moved over to the Senate Finance Committee, where there was a desperate need to move to a different direction. The Senate wanted to strike its own path to move away from the border adjusted tax and some of the proposals that were included in the blueprint for tax reform. And it was my job to put together the Senate Finance Committee package and make sure that we were ready for markup. And that's what we did. We developed the GILTI, the BEAT, and FDII, which some call FDII and the drafters called FODI. And
that's controversial.
Yeah, that is very controversial. It's a very popular acronym. And after that, during the amendment process, it was my role to shepherd the amendments, to make sure that amendments that were accepted did not trip our budget, which is $1.5 trillion of deficit financing. So my job was very fortunate and unfortunate to have to tell very senior senators that there are hundreds of amendments that cost hundreds of billions of dollars were not going to be included in the tax reform package, or they would crater the whole thing. And after that, when it became law, I was promoted to chief tax counsel, where my role really shifted from developing policy and creating legislative text to a lot of dialogue with folks like Tom about the direction of the regulations, the legislative intent, and making sure that the Senate's voice was really being carried in those regulations.
As a former House person, it pains me to say this, but I think it's objectively true that the Senate bill won over the House bill in the Senate, so congratulations.
Yes, thank you.
All right, so that's enactment. Then Tom, so you're sitting over at the Department of Treasury watching all this, participating to a certain extent. Talk about your role.
Sure. So for about 4 years, I was the head of tax policy at the Treasury Department, head of domestic tax policy. And during 2017, I was actually acting assistant secretary for about 8 months while all the tax reform was going on up on the Hill. Spent a lot of time up on the Hill working with Jennifer and her colleagues and Ways and Means folks to try and work on the draft and get Treasury's point of view across on some of the provisions in the legislation. Ultimately, I think we were mildly successful, but again, I think that the Senate bill prevailed. After enactment, the role at Treasury obviously became more important. I was heading up the implementation efforts at Treasury, putting out the regulations, drafting the regulations along with IRS chief counsel. We spent a lot of time getting the secretary and the other decision makers in the Treasury Department up to speed, as well as other components of the administration who became more and more interested in tax policy after enactment of TCJA.
Awesome. So that, here we are today. It's law. No matter what you think of it, parts of it you like, parts of it you don't like, it's law. So the question is, now what? So maybe we'll start with you, Tom, because I think the most pressing stuff is what's going on with the implementation of the law, the issuance of guidance from Treasury. So Can you just fill us in what's happening right now at Treasury? What are they working on right now? What should we expect to see in the coming weeks and months?
So relevant for this audience, I expect the next big thing we see is GILTI. That's something Treasury has said they want to get out by June 22nd. They want to finalize the GILTI regulations. I expect we're going to see some significant changes to what was proposed, but that should be coming soon. It's a little harder to parse what's coming beyond that. This morning, for example, we saw kind of a mystery package appear at the Office of Management and Budget from Treasury, a package related to Section 245 Cap A and Section 91. No one's exactly sure what that package is, but I expect in the breakout sessions later today, we'll try and hash out what that might be. A little bit longer term, later in the summer, early fall, I expect Treasury wants to finalize the other proposed international regulations that they put out under GILTI and, under BEAT and FIDI. Sorry, Jen, FIDI. The 163J regulations are of particular interest to many folks on the domestic and international side. I have heard that those regulations are being significantly rewritten. Hopefully some of the many problematic aspects of those regulations that we've all observed are going to be fixed in the finalization process. And I've also heard that Treasury is actually breaking off a piece of those regulations and maybe putting out proposed regulations for tiered partnership issues, which were kind of left behind when we were drafting the original 163J proposed regulations. I think that could be very helpful, in particular in some of the live issues that I'm seeing with clients these days. It's very difficult to apply 163J through tiered partnerships.
So we had this law enacted, the TCJA, the largest tax bill in history, right? It's a $10 trillion bill, enormous. And it wasn't, let's say the process wasn't quite Schoolhouse Rocks, like, the way we all thought it was supposed to go. So it's a little bit abnormal in how it was done. So that's different than what, at least from Treasury's point of view, in terms of the normal pace that things go by and getting guidance out. So just talk a little bit about how is it different here? What are the pressures in the process a little bit different for Treasury in getting guidance out for the TCJA than maybe sort of garden variety tax law that comes through?
Are you suggesting there's something different about this administration than past administrations, John?
No such claim.
After TCJA passed at Treasury, at least at the political level, it was a bit of a feeling of the dog who caught the car. I think early on, post-enactment, a lot of people were still in the building, still doing victory laps when the Office of Tax Policy folks and IRS Chief Counsel folks came to them with a list of about 250 regulatory packages we were proposing to do over 4 years, and a list of about 400 IRS forms and instructions that needed to change for the coming tax filing season. And it was like a record scratch. It took some convincing. This administration was very proud of its deregulatory nature. And when we came to them and said, we need to put out all of these regulations, there was definitely skepticism, if not like outright animus in some quarters. I think they've come a long way. I think the Secretary has actually come to enjoy the kind of importance of his role as the person who is trying to implement tax reform, implement the signature legislative achievement of the administration. And because of various glitches or aspects of the legislation that didn't work exactly as they were intended, I think Treasury, the importance of Treasury and the rulemaking function at Treasury has become crystallized in the minds of many people at Treasury. Now, a few other strange dynamics were at work. We had a general counsel's office at Treasury who was very skeptical of the use of authority or extending authority. We had many conversations with our colleagues on the Hill where they said, well, we meant to write that, and that's what the rule was intended to be, but we had our lawyers telling us that, well, we don't read it. We're strict constructionists, and that's not how we read things, and that's how this administration is going to operate. Again, I think that's a dynamic that's evolved, and I'm seeing the regulations that are coming out of Treasury nowadays, they've really kind of stretched their authority, and they're trying to make the legislation work as intended. So I think that's a hopeful sign for taxpayers. I think that's good for taxpayers.
So you mentioned how many regulation projects did you identify as necessary?
initially, within 2 weeks, we had identified 250 regulatory packages.
So here's my question. So you've got this compressed time frame where you're trying to get out this stuff. Or your Treasury's working around the clock trying to. How did you triage what has to come out right away versus what can be on the back burner? How did you pick in what order these things were going to come?
I think there were certain obvious candidates, things like 965, the repatriation rules had to get done immediately. There were also other big regimes that were essentially novel concepts. Section 199A, which applies the 20% partnership deduction, all of the 163J interest limitation rules, and then the entire international regime really was prioritized. So,
and now you've got this list of projects, but just because when the ones they've announced are over, that doesn't mean you're done, right? Then you turn to the second tranche, and so this is process will go on for the rest of our careers. Is that
yes,
safe to say?
we are at the beginning of tax reform, I'm sad to say.
Yeah. So, okay, now in this process of implementing the regs, so I get questions all the time, and you probably do too now that you're on this side. Okay, we don't like that, or we're concerned about that, or we've got a specific fact pattern they have to consider. How do you recommend, or what do you see as should taxpayers do to engage with Treasury? You mentioned 163J. You think there's going to be substantial changes. I assume that's because somebody on the outside said, "Hey, this doesn't work," or "Here's something else to think about." So, talk to what your recommendation on what people should do to engage with Treasury.
Yeah, historically, Treasury and the IRS have always been open to comments. I think the notice and comment process this time around is of particular importance. I mean, all of the regulations we've been talking about, Will mentioned the number of pages that have come out this year. Keep in mind, at the Treasury Department within the Office of Tax Policy, I had 50 lawyers who were drafting all of this. Now, there are a lot of lawyers at IRS Chief Counsel who were also helpful, but essentially it's a fairly small brain trust that's trying to get their head around all of this and get out regulations to help the public. If we weren't able to tap the collective tax brain of folks who are in this room and practitioners, we wouldn't have gotten out what we did. And in terms of getting fixes to proposed regulations, I think it's equally important that people come in. Treasury really does listen. I can point to numerous examples of specific changes that were made because of one conversation that we had with a particular taxpayer. So it's helpful.
You do listen, and
They are absolutely listening.
But I can tell you that on the Hill, and you probably feel the same way, Jen, that you realize you can't legislate from a vacuum. You need help from the outside. And same thing with regs. You need to understand what's happening in the real world to really make the law effective. And so that's always been my advice: is go talk to people. You don't need to hire a fancy lobbyist or anything to go see Treasury or the Hill. All right.
In the regulatory process, if I might add, it is important to talk to Congress because there are so many discussions every day happening behind the scenes, as Tom and I can attest to, where senators, members make their regulatory priorities known, and that can really change the dynamic.
Yes.
And I think this time around in particular, because there's been so much additional political influence on Treasury's rulemaking, you have the folks at Office of Management and Budget who are now prominently involved in the tax rulemaking process. There are many other avenues to pursue. That's a great point.
All right. Regs. We've heard, I think the entire tax community has June 22nd circled on their calendars. And we've been thinking about this date as like the end-all, be-all of, oh my gosh, this is the key date for the issuance of regs. I think the more we think about it, though, I'm wondering, is that overrated? Have we put too much emphasis on this June 22nd date? Talk a little bit about what that is intended to do and how important it really is.
So I think it is very overrated. June 22nd would be 18 months from the passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So if Treasury wanted to make any rules retroactive to the beginning of, or the passage of the Tax Act, they would have to have those rules finalized by June 22nd. There are not many rules that Treasury would want to apply retroactive to begin with, and this administration in particular has shown that it is not really interested in applying rules retroactively. They're very concerned. They put out a policy statement a few months ago about how prospective rulemaking is going to be the order of the day here. Treasury can get reliance back to the date it released proposed regulations. So any proposed regulations released in 2018, Treasury could make the rules retroactive to that date regardless of June 22nd. So I don't think we need to worry about June 22nd with respect to any of the rules that folks are concerned about.
So proposed regs issued in 18 can be effective in 18 regardless of when finalized, as long as they're basically substantially similar, right? And then proposed regs issued in 19 would only be effective beginning in 19 under that same theory. What would you do and then in 18, I guess you're sort of operating in a pre-reg world, what you would do for where you've got a proposed reg in 19. You just...
That's right. I mean, we just went through tax filing season for 18, and there's lots of questions along those lines. I think we've been advising clients you can rely on rules that are in proposed regulations if you like them and if you apply them consistently. Otherwise, take a reasonable basis is kind of what we've been saying if there's no rules out there.
Got it. Okay. All right, now let's shift to you, Jen, and talk a little bit about, from a legislative point of view, what things can we expect to see from Congress, right? So we've got the reg piece. Let's talk about legislation. And we haven't seen much, really, to be honest, since the TCJA. I think, Congress is still catching its breath. Let's go to another thing that we got lots of questions about, which is technical corrections, right? We had this huge bill, and we've already identified, depending on who you ask, 78, 110 technical corrections. There's probably more coming. Corrections to the law where, as Tom was saying, Congress saying, this is what we meant. We just didn't draft it as artfully as we should have. Let's fix it. And they don't seem to be going anywhere, even though everybody knows that the law has these errors in it. What do we have to do to get the technical corrections bill through?
Well, the first step to a technical corrections bill is it has to be a technical correction. You just have to meet the definition, and that's a term of art. You have to have a multi-sided agreement that requires House Ways and Means Republicans, House Ways and Means Democrats, Senate Finance Republicans, Senate Finance Democrats, and JCT all have to agree on each provision. We're a long ways away from that. Even the non-controversial technical corrections like qualified improvement property, there's an NOL date change that needs to be made, and there's a deductibility of sexual harassment fees. Those are non-controversial. Everyone agreed on day 2 that they were technical corrections, and even those have a very low chance of being passed. It's just a very politicized technical corrections package. What you saw from the House last year was not a consensus product, so it was not part of regular order, and Senate Finance, for instance, Republicans did not sign on to that. Chairman Hatch did not release a technical corrections bill or introduce it.
So that bill, the one you're talking about, which is, was Kevin Brady, the then Republican Ways and Means Chair, was released January 2nd, I think. His technical corrections bill, that was his only. That was not, nobody else said we're signing on to that, right? So you look at that, and it's probably useful to look at and just to have ideas what Congress is thinking about for technical corrections, but we can't assume that that's going to go without further negotiations, and the Democrats in particular aren't on board right now.
That's right. And everything has to be renegotiated now. When we were close to getting some technical corrections over the finish line, now with the shift in power in Congress, it's going to be, you have to go back to the table and renegotiate the carrying costs for each technical and what package it can be tacked onto.
Got it. So don't hold your breath.
No.
But one last question on technicals before we move on. It's fair to say they don't all have to move together. I think a lot of people think there's 100 of them. They're either all going to happen or none of them are going to happen. Not true, right? You could break off like the QIP one that's not controversial, or a couple of the less controversial ones, get those through, and work your way through the package over years.
That's right.
Right, and
No,
some
that
of them are
can
more
be done.
controversial than others. 958B4, for one, many of you probably are aware of as a controversial one, so, okay.
And there was one technical, the grain glitch was fixed shortly thereafter, arguably not a technical.
Arguably not a technical, but.
Cast as a technical correction.
Right,
So.
right. Okay, now let's talk about other legislation then. Fine, technicals, maybe we're waiting, treaties, maybe not. What else are we going to see either this year or sometime in the 116th Congress that we're in right now before we get to the big 2020 elections? What other pieces of tax legislation are we likely or maybe going to see?
Well, last year there was a push RISA and IRS admin over the finish line. There's
That's a retirement package and an IRS reform bill,
and
right?
an IRS reform bill, which is like administrative provisions, and that failed. It is not. Neither are law. And right now, because of the shift in power, there's going to be a package, I would imagine a package coming out of the House on the international provisions. There was a report that was issued by Senate Finance minority staff, the Wyden report, on the new international system that suggested kind of the leanings of where they would go should they rewrite that international tax system. And there are some clues in there. And I know a lot of people say, well, there are a lot of provisions in the tax bill that were brand new. But staff they road test a lot of ideas through things like reports, packages, working groups, and hearings in particular. I mean, the BEAT, for instance, was a brand new idea, but we had it drafted and we had it road tested in a hearing. If you go back and watch that hearing on Inbound, every element of the BEAT was road tested and questioned by the senators, so it did go through regular order. So I would look for clues like that, especially as the House Ways and Means Committee, as soon as the hearings start to ramp up, you're going to see a lot of those ideas be road tested by the staff.
So these things just don't come out of nowhere.
No.
Like they're usually, if you're looking closely, there's little signs along the way.
Yep.
Sometimes you have to read between the lines, but there's usually something out there. What about extenders? Like, this is the thing that it's madness, right? It's always hanging over Congress's head. They've got provisions that expired all the way back in 2017 that they're trying to do. They've got provisions that expired in 2018. They got some that will expire this year. What's the state of play on whether or not they'll do this extenders package? Because there might be one or two that folks here care about.
Yeah, the extenders package, there was a push at the end of last year to move the expired provisions. That failed. There was a desire to go back to the, especially with the shift in leadership, to get a better deal on extenders. Maybe you could get a 2-year deal, maybe it's just a 1-year deal, but it isn't a guarantee. I mean, extenders do have to be done, and there's an understanding among, the senators and the members that it's just, you just have to do it, right? You have expired provisions. Some of them are supposed to stimulate the economy. How are you stimulating economic behavior 2 years out? That behavior already passed.
Right, 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
what about 954C6? So that's one, the CFC look through. Well, that is one that expires at the end of this year.
Right.
Is that going to be in play, or are they just going to focus on the ones that are already expired?
Yeah, I mean, in extenders land, that's not even an extender. I mean, it hasn't
Right.
expired yet, and it's been less than a year. So,
Right, like why would we worry about that
yeah.
till it's expired?
Yeah, they typically try to focus on the provisions that have already expired.
Right, that one's going to be an interesting one. It's an uphill battle. A lot of people are pushing hard for it. But the way the TCJA changed the landscape, not everybody's totally on board with that now either. You're going to see a divide, I think, within the business community as to whether they want it. So that's an interesting one to watch the dynamic play out. Will it get in scope at all because it doesn't expire till the end of this year? And even if it does, will they agree to extend it when some people don't want it extended? That's an interesting one to watch.
Usually they're non-controversial, so.
Usually.
Okay,
let's just take like a minute to just look forward. Let's imagine a world after 2020. The Democrats now have the House, the Senate, and the White House, and they can, we know they don't necessarily like the TCJA. They can change things. What do you think is on that short list of things that would be priorities for Democrats to change?
The corporate rate.
Corporate
that would be
rate.
at the top of the list. I mean, I think that in an election year.
You mean it's going to go down further?
Oh, yeah, of
Right,
course.
no.
It'll be 10%. Everyone
Sorry,
will be
right.
excited.
Okay.
No, I mean,
It's
I think
going up. It's only going to go one direction from here.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Each corporate rate point, the rule of thumb is it's about $100 to $150 billion in revenue. You can pay for a lot of EITC. You can pay for a lot of ACA expansion. You can pay for a lot of things with 5 points on the corporate rate.
Right. So that is
that's an
going
easy
to be,
sell politically.
Right. So just an important thing to watch. As long as Republicans, I think, have the Senate or the House or even the White House, they'll probably block that. But if you get 2020 and you have uniform Democratic control, I think there's going to be upward pressure on the rate. Right.
And there are a lot of rates that key off of the corporate rate. The GILTI, the BEAT, FDII, they all key off of the rate. So if the corporate rate goes up, you get even more revenue.
Yeah.
And more fun things that people love to pay for.
And you can cut or cap Section 199A too, because
Right.
that's the
Yeah.
that's the trade-off for the corporate rate for pass-throughs.
Well, that's all just terrible news. Can we just stop talking about it now because you're
Although
ruining everybody's day?
199 cafe is generally beloved. So.
All right, we are out of time. Let me just end on a happy note since we ended, I don't want to end on a bad note. Just today, we released a new sort of tool, and you can kind of see a picture of it here, and it's in your apps. It is your one-stop shop for all guidance related to the TCJA. So you can go in and pick your topic, international, then go down to guilty, go down, you'll have all the latest developments, proposed regs, final regs, notices, et cetera, all in reverse chronological order in there. So I encourage you to look at that.